So our third lecture today is going to continue what we worked on already with Romeo and Juliet. And my concerns are a way of evaluating the central conflict of the play, a way for us to look at the characters, and then from there to really consider the central ideas of the play. First off, the conflict, which is fairly localized, isn't necessarily believable to us as a contemporary audience. The constructed notion of having two families at war with one another almost, so much so that a prince or a governing body of society has to separate these families, remains at best oblique to the world that we live in today. What I'm more concerned with, and what really works with Shakespeare's plays, is that very often the conflict within the play itself, if not always, is rather localized. But this localized conflict, which is external, leads to often rather complicated internal conflicts that speak to the human experience, and I think make the plays very teachable and rather universal and timeless in the ways that students connect to them. The external conflict and the way that it's internalized by the characters shifts, and the most complex of this sort of process, if you will, is embodied by the characters of Romeo and Juliet, because of course this really affects the way they're able to execute their love. Pardon my verb. I might have given away a spoiler. So let's look at our characters, and I'm going to set up 6 of them for our talk today. And for me, they're the 6 characters that really are integral to the play, which doesn't mean that there aren't other characters that are as well. We've got Romeo and Juliet, and then we have Friar Lawrence and the nurse, and then we have Mercutio and Tybalt. And I'm going to look at these characters, drawing your attention to the ways in which the characters foil one another. They work almost as couples, if you will, mirroring different sides of their personalities to amplify the seriousness of what we study in this play. And this is, of course, the death of young people because of the forces of external conflicts that really shouldn't matter. As we talked about last class, Romeo remains at best almost inactive, and this will shift as I finish up the character list that I've cited to you with Tybalt. Romeo needs to act. He begins to act, as we looked at in our last recorded lecture, and of course, as we talked about in class, because Juliet awakens him. She creates for Romeo a response to his journaling, to his introverted quiet time where he's trying to process his feelings. He all of a sudden has to live his feelings. He has to move out of what he understands as his woe, explained to Mercutio in the reading I had done in an earlier recorded lecture. Juliet, on the other hand, her desire is embodied, and not right away, but really amplified in the balcony scene, through the desperation of her situation. And part of Shakespeare's modernity is his representation of female characters that really question the ways in which women lived. The ideas embodied with Shakespeare's principal female characters, especially within the tragedies, really show us as an audience the weak spots, to say the least, of a patriarchal society. The patriarchy is, of course, emphasized through Juliet's father and Paris, who aren't in my character list today. And Juliet's desperation comes from her desire to be released from the shackles of her father. And I don't really think contemporary audience might understand this in the way that an audience of the time, or an audience right up to, I'd say even the women's lib movement in the 1960s, would have understood this. But I think as we all come of age, we understand that we want to be different from our families. We want to provide an option from the world from which we came, and we want to find ourselves. And I think in many ways, Romeo and Juliet embody this deep-seated desire to be oneself. In many ways, the existential crisis of the characters is based on their inability to be together. So it is kind of localized as it's tied to love and their desire for one another. And of course, the tragedy of the play. Their outlets, their vehicles for truth are Friar Lawrence and the nurse, that these adult characters provide almost mentoring or parenting positions for our main characters, where their secrets can be kept and cherished and solutions can begin. Friar Lawrence and in part the apothecary create the solutions necessary for Romeo and Juliet, those solutions that sadly get botched by the end of the play. And Juliet's nurse really keeps this secret from her family. She wants Juliet to be happy. On the flip side, Romeo and Juliet have either a member of the family, i.e. cousin Tybalt, or a best friend, Mercutio, who can't get past the desire to fight, to induce violence, to go into the forbidden, right? The prince has forbidden these characters, or all characters in general, within the confines of the play. And Mercutio and Tybalt spar. Tybalt seeks revenge upon Romeo when he finds out that Romeo's love is Juliet. And it is Mercutio who intervenes between Tybalt and Romeo. The 1996 version does an amazing job with this. I think it's on Venice Beach, if I'm not mistaken. I think I might have wanted to screen it before I recorded this, but we'll maybe have time to look at this together. And these characters, we get to see a representation of Tybalt's aggression and violence in the way that Romeo is treated in this film adaptation. Mercutio intervenes. He makes fun of Tybalt. The Shakespeare's words are twisted, amplified even more. And Tybalt's masculinity is made fun of until, of course, the characters duel and Mercutio dies early in the play. His death is a turning point that shifts the reality of the characters themselves, because Romeo will be shifted by this. He will have to face that his best friend is dead because he intervened for him. And Romeo thus understands himself as a coward of sorts. And he will seek revenge upon Tybalt. Mercutio's last words ring true as Mercutio denies what has happened. Nay, a scratch, it says. And as he, falls to the ground, a plague on both your houses, a plague on both your houses. And he dies. His character dies. Death. Death in this play and death in Shakespeare is also something, thank goodness, we don't deal with on a regular basis. But perhaps people did at the time that these plays came out. And thus the consequence for going against family or against state, as seen in this play, could result in death, as we see with Mercutio, and then shortly thereafter, Tybalt. Romeo will seek revenge, as we know, and he will become, quote, banished, removed from the play itself. Juliet, in a state of powerful desperation, right? She is action. She does not sit back. Will go to Friar Lawrence and the apothecary and seek the responses that she needs to save her from her predicament, which of course get foiled at the end of the play. Now, how do we understand just 6 of our characters in this way? How do we realize that the differences between internal and external conflicts almost localizes the external conflict to amplify the internal conflicts that our characters go through? As we talked about before, the play itself hooks the reader, even though we all know what's going to happen. When we see a production being put on somewhere, we want to go see it. But we know that this play doesn't really have a happy ending. but there's something about the passion that these characters embody that keeps us going for this play, adaptation, adaptation, after adaptation, course after course. From this, I want us to think about the central ideas within this play, the themes, if you will. You can use your reading module and you could turn to page 7, or you could let me lead and know that I'm going to review what we have so far in the reading module, and then from there we can go on to what we feel is a class, right? We might have universal themes, but we'll notice as readership will shift and sensibilities will shift, we might have different ways of understanding these themes. So the abiding quality of romantic love. This is really an interesting theme, the quality of love. How can these young people feel such an intensity? I think this theme really allows us to reinforce the idea that authentic lovers, if they can't be united in this world, need to find a way to be together. And of course, this is a rather sad one, as it would only be within death that these characters can unite, as we'll know through the end of the play. We also have the placement of the individual within society, and both of these young characters reveal to us that it's rather difficult to create a space for oneself, let alone one's desires, within a society that isn't accommodating. In other words, because a society doesn't allow these characters to interact, they can't really find a way to truly be together. We also see the volatile nature of society. And I think what Shakespeare amplifies in this play is that many societies end up far too violent for arbitrary and unimportant reasons. And how does this violence affect the young people coming of age within this world? For Juliet in particular, we see the overarching power of patriarchal society. We realize that our female characters generally don't have the same freedoms at all, let alone the same power as our male characters. And in particular, Juliet standing up to her father reveals to us her intrinsic strength, but also the rather horrifying response of her father that shows us why she runs to Romeo the way she does. Hardly 14, not only has she fallen in love big time, but she's basically been auctioned off by her father to Paris, who, especially in the 96 version, very handsome, but it's not about that. It's not about what someone might look like. It's about feelings. And what we realize in Romeo and Juliet is all our themes are tied to deep-seated emotions because this play is character-driven. We also end up with death and suicide and social pressure holding together a kind of main idea for this play, that there seems to be an overriding severity of sadness, of woe, that will show us that due to social pressure, these young characters actually configure and rely upon suicide and thus death as an escape. In a more ethereal version, we have the construction of fate and destiny. We have the star-crossed lovers within the play that, as much as they're supposed to come together, their coming together results in their very young deaths. We also have a representation of teenage marriage. And we realize, not just in this play, but in many representations of popular culture throughout the ages, some young people are capable of feeling intense emotions attached to desire and love. And we see this happen in Romeo and Juliet, amplified through the reality of marriage. Marriage is a way to free these characters from the external conflict of the play. What we also see within the play, and I think this is fairly strong, is the ideological divide between the young and the old. Our young characters think very differently from the older characters. And this allows us, as it would the characters, to question their spaces within society, but also to question their places in the world. We have, and this is harder for us, the absurdity of family feuding, right? I'm sure none of my students would be able to tell me a story about families who feud, but at this point in time, this rather obviously was part of society where families would have horrible death feuds with one another. What we end up as the last universal theme that I'm going to touch upon in this recorded lecture is the consequence of revenge. Vengeance is not a great emotion. It functions as a hilarious, sometimes fantasy. And we see this in popular culture where characters sort of imagine their revenge, but vengeance consumes us. And we definitely see this through reading death as a metaphor in this play. So I hope that this recorded lecture helped us understand our characters, the way that the conflicts are twofold, and as well, a way to start thinking about the universal themes within the play. Thanks.